from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, the framework of an EU tariff deal is set as the focus turns now to trade negotiations between the world's two largest economies.
We have a good relationship with China, but China's tough. We're making deals that are good for us, but we want them to be good for everybody.
The latest on where trade talks stand between the U.S. and China when Greta Peisch, former General Counsel for the Office of the USTR, joins us.
And President Trump ups the pressure on Vladimir Putin to end Russia's war with Ukraine, bringing forward the deadline to reach a ceasefire. We'll discuss with Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State under the Biden administration, who will also talk with us about Trump's break with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over starvation in Gaza.
Plus, the Senate stuck in session while members of the House head to their home districts to face the public. We'll talk to Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana about how his constituents are reacting to everything from the president's new tax law to persistent questions over the Epstein files.
But we begin tonight with the news coming out of President Trump's still ongoing trip to Scotland. Most of it focused, of course, on trade. And Bloomberg's Michael Shepard is joining us live in studio with the latest. So, Mike, obviously he spent the day and the evening with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. We already had a trade agreement with the UK ironed out some time ago. The EU, though, struck one yesterday just ahead of the Friday deadline.
Yes, and the president and his team are still basking in that and letting slip some more of the details surrounding the agreement that was unveiled with the European Commission president yesterday in Scotland. This, as President Donald Trump said yesterday, was the big one. And the EU, of course, is the largest U.S. trading partner. And it was one also that had faced the threat of tariffs as high as 30%, pending the president's most recent warning to the bloc that if they didn't reach an agreement by August 1st, they would be hit with that eye-watering tariff level. Now, the 15% level that they've agreed upon has not sat well with everyone in the bloc, yet many of the leaders there are recognizing that they are making the best of a bad situation, that the 15% is something that they will have to live with, they will have to accept. They are hearing from business groups and business leaders there that this is not okay. And even some of the representative governments, including France and even Germany, are raising some of their own misgivings about it, with France suggesting that the EU should move to what's known as an anti-coercion instrument that would allow pursuit of retaliatory measures.
Well, it's on to China as well. The president's lieutenants in Stockholm today to open talks, or resume talks, I should say, with China. And there are a lot of questions about how much this administration is willing to mortgage for a deal. That includes export controls, which the three of us have talked about a lot with regard to NVIDIA, but more than that as well, as we learn that the president of Taiwan will not be allowed to even touch down in the U.S. on his way to Central America. How bad does Donald Trump want a deal?
Well, it's pretty clear the president is eager to advance this. And it was interesting, his framing of the understanding with China seems to be sanded down a little bit from how he had described it back in June, when he was talking about it as a deal. He is now saying we have something like a deal. They want something more refined that will bring progress toward what he really wants, which is that sit down with Chinese President Xi Jinping before the end of the year. And the ideal timing would be around a regional summit in South Korea sometime in October. But they really would like to see this happen and also, Joe, resolve some of the issues that didn't come up in nearly as much detail as the export controls and the battle over rare earths. It's the question of the fentanyl tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on China over its role in the trade of this opiate into the U.S. And it's also the question of, and this connects to the president's misgivings over Russia and Vladimir Putin's willingness to actually pursue a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. This is the question of the U.S. moving to impose sanctions on countries that buy oil from Russia. And, of course, China is a prime buyer of that. China is not really interested in having that conversation, but the Treasury Secretary has indicated that will come up. And we also may see some evidence that the Microsoft hack, which has been attributed to China, may also be a topic of those discussions, too,
There's
Joe.
a lot there to talk about. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard with great analysis. Thank you, Mike. Yesterday, President Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made this announcement regarding a trade deal between the U.S. and the EU.
We've reached a deal. I think you were saying this is probably the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity.
We have a deal, and it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive.
I think it's the biggest deal ever made. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
For more on the implications of this trade framework with the EU and the ongoing discussions with China we were just talking about, we add the voice of Greta Peisch, partner at Wiley and former General Counsel for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. It's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Is Donald Trump proving that tariffs work?
Well, he's making a lot of announcements. What we don't have so far is a lot of details still on these deals, right? What we're seeing in part is perhaps agreements to make a deal with the EU, with Japan. We're seeing fact sheets from the administrations. We don't have even a joint statement, which shows a meeting of the minds over what is agreed to. So we're really still seeing a lot of questions about what is the bottom line. What are we getting out of these deals?
Well, and we had a question as well until it was cleared up by both sides between the U.S. and EU, Greta, as to whether or not this 15% rate was going to apply to key sectors like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, where there are ongoing Section 232 investigations into them, results we expect just weeks from now. If Europe gets a 15% rate on those sectors, but the U.S. makes the claim that other countries need to have a higher tariff on the grounds of national security reasons, could that undermine the case for those Section 232 tariffs, legally speaking?
Well, I think that's to be determined. The basis, we don't even have the reports out for those 232 investigations and what the basis is for the national security concerns for those investigations. I mean, I think we anticipate it will be something related to needing to make those products, key products here in the United States. But certainly now there's some recognition that maybe we do need to get some components, some supplies, some pharmaceuticals from trading partners. We've seen that in the past with 232. We had different agreements with different countries on steel and aluminum in the first Trump administration and later. So, I think that there is a precedent, at least under that authority, when we're looking at these sectoral tariffs, to treat different countries differently. They do have to have a rationale and some basis for doing so, though.
Yeah. Greta, you mentioned in the outset here the lack of paper on both sides, the lack of readout from these meetings, never mind details on the deals. We're calling them framework agreements for a reason here. But we are learning as well about some discord, as you refer. The Prime Minister of France referred to this deal as submission. And on the early edition of Balance of Power today, we spoke with Michelle Schultz, the founder, managing partner of Schultz Trade Law. She's been talking to her clients impacted by this and had this to say about the lack of detail here. Listen.
It is one set number, but it's a little bit misleading because we have layers of different types of tariffs that are still going on, like the steel and aluminum tariffs. Also, all 27 countries within the EU have to sign off on this agreement, and I haven't seen them do that yet. In fact, I've seen a little bit of negative feedback. It seems to me that Ursula von der Leyen was correct when she said this is essentially the best we're going to get.
That said, what happens if all 27 countries don't sign off?
Well, it depends on what you mean by sign off. I mean, I think they can all sign off on the fact that the tariffs will remain at least 15% instead of 30% while they continue to negotiate, right? The question is, what changes is the EU going to make at the end of the day? Are they going to be changing their tariffs to benefit only the United States? That is something that member countries potentially are going to need to agree to and sign off on implementing. But that's down the road. We don't know how long, how many months it's going to take to really iron out what the contours are. And in the meantime, the EU has a 15% tariff, which was at least the immediate objective.
Okay, so that's Europe, Greta. I'd like to ask you as well about China, as talks will resume for a second day in Stockholm tomorrow. Is the best we can hope for here a re-agreement to the original agreement that was struck in Geneva? What constitutes forward progress here other than another extending of the deadline beyond August 12th?
That's a great question. I think what we still don't have a clear sense of from the administration is what they view as the optimum end state with China. where do they want this relationship to go? What are they trying to either get out of China, or what barriers are they trying to build up and put in place? We have seen through those very high escalatory tariffs for a period of time an almost experiment with decoupling that has then been pulled back, in part perhaps related to China's retaliatory actions. But we don't have a roadmap of where this journey is taking us, where they want to get to. And so it does seem like these talks may just be to keep the conversation going, to have stability in the relationship, to ensure that essential products for the United States are flowing, and have the conversation with China about what their bottom lines are.
Mm-hmm. Well, how much leverage does the United States have at the table here in Stockholm, knowing that the White House has already put the green light on the H20 chip for NVIDIA to sell in China, and now the administration has blocked Taiwan's president from even stopping to refuel on his way to Central America? What does that tell us about our posture at the table?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily read too much into the geopolitical aspects having a direct impact on the trade relationship. And I think that these often are and can be separate channels. But clearly, the United States does want to maintain and maybe not rock the boat too much as it continues these trade conversations. And I guess the question of leverage goes back to, well, to what end? What are you trying to achieve with that leverage? And again, we just don't have that clear sense from the administration of what they're trying to get out of China. Are they just truly trying to decouple and find their way to do that in a way that does not have a large impact on the U.S. economy and critical supply chains, or is it something else? What do they want from them?
All right, Greta Peisch, partner at Wiley Rein and former General Counsel to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Thank you for joining us. Now for a look at how markets are digesting all of the geopolitical news on top of a huge week of economic data and corporate earnings. We turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romain Bostic, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romain?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. That was a very dramatic intro for a somewhat undramatic day. You see the S&P 500 not doing much of anything, but believe it or not, it's up a fraction of a percent, and that's good enough for a record high. But all of the market action today was really what you saw in the FX market here. One of the strongest days for the dollar since at least early May, and that was largely on the back of the framework of an agreement for an EU trade deal. The euro plunging today as a lot of people now start to assess the winners and losers in all this, and at least the consensus today seems to be that some of the economic pain is going to be felt much more overseas than it is right here in the United States of America. That's a big part of the reason why you see risk assets continue to climb here in the United States, and it's a big part of the reason why you've seen the dollar, which of course started off the year with one of its worst starts to a year in decades, now putting together a string of wins as it continues to creep back higher, now back up to its June levels. But the tariff issue isn't over yet. And we just got two earnings after the bell today, Joe and Kaylee, that I think really illustrate that. And one is Whirlpool. This is a company, a maker of appliances, obviously, but they make the majority of the appliances that they sell in the U.S., they make right here in the U.S. However, they're not actually seeing a real bump from the tariffs just yet. That's a big part of the reason why you see the shares down 12% in the after hours trade. The executive saying in the press release here that right now they're seeing a huge pull forward in demand, but not for Whirlpool appliances, but for a lot of the appliances made by Asian competitors. And that's something that they think is going to take a few more months to play out before maybe they start to see the benefit on U.S. suppliers.
Yet another wrinkle on this story, Romain. That's fascinating. So what drives us through the week? Is it the walk up to August 1st, or traders are bored with tariffs and it's actual earnings that are going to move stocks?
I think it is earnings, Joe. This is the busiest week of earnings season. More than 160 companies in the S&P set to report, and big ones. We're talking, Amazons, Apples of the world, Metas as well. And then don't forget, Joe, we have a Fed meeting in a day and a half. I mean, they start tomorrow, and of course, midday on Wednesday, we get the press conference, and I'm sure a lot of the questions are going to be less about where rates are going and more about, I guess, where Jay Powell might be going or not going.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
We'll have special coverage, of course, when that takes place. It's going to be an interesting news conference this week. Romain, great to have you, as always. Bloomberg's Romain Bostic at World Headquarters in New York. Coming up, the House might be on recess, but with a government shutdown deadline on the horizon, We're here to talk about the chamber's next move with Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana. First, though, President Trump says he will shorten his timeline for Vladimir Putin to reach a truce with Ukraine before punishing him with new sanctions. We'll discuss that with Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Disappointed. I'm disappointed in President Putin. Very disappointed in him. So we're going to have to look, and I'm going to reduce that 50 days that I gave him to a lesser number because I think I already know the answer what's going to happen.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kayleigh Lines. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We thank you for joining us as President Trump there walking into his bilateral meeting with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Turnberry, Scotland today made news, saying he would reduce the 50-day deadline. There he gave Vladimir Putin to reach a truce with Ukraine. And joining us now with more insights on President Trump's announcement, his evolution on this matter, we turn to Wendy Sherman on Balance of Power, former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, now senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. It's always great, Wendy, to have you with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. What are the conversations and the comments that President Trump is hearing behind the scenes? It was Ursula von der Leyen yesterday, the UK's Keir Starmer today, that brought the matter of Ukraine to the forefront of his mind with that kind of urgency where he's now willing to shorten the deadline to take action.
I'm sure he has heard from both the Prime Minister and from Ursula von der Leyen that all of Europe's security is at risk. And if all of Europe's security is at risk, not just Ukraine's, then it would mean over time that the U.S. would get more engaged through NATO if in no other way. And so he's probably heard quite a bit about this and how Putin puts pressure on many of the member states of not only NATO, but of the European Union. And so I think we've heard this from the president today, but I must say, Joe, I'm a bit skeptical about what this really means. We've seen the president sort of put out a feeler and then pull it back, put out a feeler. He wants to get Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table, and there's nothing so far that would get him there. And the one thing that might would be what's called secondary sanctions, which you all know well. That would largely hurt China and India and raise gas prices probably in the United States because it would raise the price of oil worldwide. So this is not something he's going to rush to do. So I think he's going to let out little bits and pieces here, trying to pull Vladimir Putin in. But as your former commentator and analyst said, I think the president's real focus right now is getting a good meeting with Xi Jinping of China.
Yeah. Well, so to your point on secondary sanctions, because that is what President Trump is threatening could be implemented 10 to 12 days from now as he shortens this deadline. Do you expect Vladimir Putin will see that as a bluff and call it as one?
I think that what the president has said is he knows what he wants to do, but that may mean that he will say to the U.S. Senate, let's go forward with your legislation, which falls short of secondary sanctions. I'm not sure the president is ready to put secondary sanctions on the table, though I don't think that the Senate bill alone would get Vladimir Putin to the table. Even though he hasn't made a lot of progress in Ukraine, he thinks he can outweight Ukraine. But I must say the people of Ukraine are tremendously resilient and really tough and ready to hit Russia where it hurts. We might see the president give more weapons to Ukraine and give them more latitude to use those weapons. But we'll see whether Putin thinks this is for real or a bluff.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the president, again, is ready to really take on those secondary sanctions because of the follow-on results to particularly China, India, and of course, to the American consumer.
Well, I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on the role that China plays in all of this in the background. Are you suggesting then that more aid for Ukraine or secondary sanctions against Russia might have to wait until a meeting with Xi or an actual deal being in place?
You know, it's hard to know, Joe, as you all were discussing just a little bit ago. We saw the president of Taiwan, who on a bipartisan basis has made a transit stop in the United States, basically say, not a good time for me to take the trip, because I think behind the scenes, the U.S. was saying to Taiwan, we're not going to tell you no, but we'd rather you wait a little bit. We hope you don't have a high-profile stop in the United States. And so I think they just decided this is too hard, because I think Donald Trump is focused on getting a good meeting with Xi Jinping. I think that's why we're seeing this slow work in Stockholm, basically extending the truce between the United States and China. And my concern is that President Trump is willing to put Taiwan's future on the table, put Ukraine on the table, put many things on the table in the effort to ensure that critical minerals continue to come from China, that their markets are open to our corporations, that NVIDIA can continue to send its chips. There's a lot at play here. And I think the president's priority is not Vladimir Putin, is not Taiwan, it's Xi Jinping.
Well, he also still is focused on issues elsewhere, including in the Middle East, Wendy, specifically Gaza, as we're seeing images flooding the internet and the news cycle of malnourished children in Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu contends that there is not a campaign of starvation there. Let's listen to what he had to say yesterday.
Israel is presented as though we are applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza. What a bold-faced lie. There is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza. Otherwise, there would be no Gazans.
Wendy, do you see a bold-faced lie here? And is it one being told about Israel or by Israel?
There is no doubt that there is starvation in Gaza. There is no doubt that children are dying every day because of a lack of food. There isn't nearly, not even close to the amount of food getting in. I know that it was announced that there were going to be these airdrops, but the airdrops are about 2 trucks worth of food. It looks great on TV, but it really does not solve the problem. This is not the Berlin airlift that we're talking about, that some of us may have recalled in history. This is really a need to have access. And President Trump spoke today with Starmer about working with Europe to create aid stations. But quite frankly, we know how to deliver humanitarian aid. It requires access. It requires humanitarian corridors. It requires a ceasefire, or at least humanitarian corridors for that food to be delivered. And all of that needs to be put into place. It's not like people don't know how to do this. We do. The World Food Program knows how to do this. But the current mechanism is wholly inadequate.
All right, Wendy, we appreciate you joining us. Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration. Thank you so much. And coming up on Balance of Power, the House is out for summer recess, with Republican lawmakers now tasked with selling the president's new tax bill to their constituents. We'll discuss with Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana next on Bloomberg.
Here's what the one big beautiful bill means for you in very concrete terms. Number one, we're going to see take-home pay go up in the United States of America. In this district, probably $7,000, $8,000 per family over the next 3 to 4 years. We're going to see your taxes cut. If that big, beautiful bill hadn't passed, you all would have gotten a tax increase to the tune of thousands of dollars to each and every single one of you. And we happen to believe that you all work very hard for your money. You ought to keep it, not the federal government.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington, listening to the pitch there from Vice President J.D. Vance back home in Ohio this morning to sell the administration's massive tax bill that was signed into law. couple of weeks ago. We knew that the sales pitch was coming. The road trip begins as lawmakers across the country are beginning to face their constituents over details of the legislation. The prospect of a government shutdown when they return to Washington is not helping the debate over the release of the Epstein files as well. Joining us now with insights on balance of power, we turn to Bloomberg's Alicia Diaz, covering Congress for us. It's great to see you. You heard the pitch there from J.D. Vance, and not a mystery to see him show up in a swing district that is currently represented by a Democrat. Is that the messaging we hear between now and the midterms?
Exactly. So this is the big opportunity for Republicans to talk with their voters, go back with, small business owners, constituents, and really get to hear how voters are feeling about this big, beautiful bill. Of course, J.D. Vance is touting this as a win for the party. This is what they campaigned on. But it really comes down to how voters are feeling and how that ties into the midterm elections in 2026.
Yeah, knowing that polling on the legislation didn't show that it was overwhelmingly popular, at least while it was being formed. I guess we'll see how it's actually received. We also have a question as to how it would be received by the American electorate if they all come back from recess, send their elected representatives on their way back to D.C., and shortly thereafter we see a government shutdown. What exactly should we be watching in terms of forward progress on the appropriations process to avoid that?
It's a great question. So, of course, lawmakers are back home. They're having their August recess, and there is no short of things to do when they get back. September 30th, there's another government shutdown deadline, which it seems like we've had many of these in the past couple of years and months. So definitely it's something to look out for as to how they're going to get these bills through the door. The Senate has to have 60 votes, so some bipartisan negotiating happening there. But the pressure will be on for sure.
Mm-hmm. Indeed it will. And we know you'll cover it for us. Bloomberg's Alicia Diaz, thank you so much. And for more on the latest from Congress, we turn now to Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee as well as the Budget Committee and is joining us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, welcome back to Balance of Power. You, of course, are now at home in your district for recess. What response are you getting from constituents about the big, beautiful bill? Is it more excitement or concern?
No, a lot of excitement. I come from Northeast Indiana. Fort Wayne is the center of my district. A lot of manufacturing, a lot of agriculture, logistics, a lot of small businesses. And so I hear from a lot of constituents that they're anxious to now have the tax rates, in law. They're going to stay in place. Of course, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips is also very beneficial to a lot of businesses in my district. They're excited about the trade policy that they're hearing about from President Trump as he's overseas right now. There's several factors that are going to really create a strong economy, and two of them have been addressed already. That's the taxes, and then also trade and tariffs, which President Trump has been a leader on. And that last piece is the interest rates. And I think as the first two continue to come into focus for people to plan on productivity moving forward, that's going to give them a lot of certainty, but it's still that interest rate that still is holding some of the economy back, especially when it comes to real estate and home ownership.
We'll be talking about that a lot more this week when the Federal Reserve meets, of course, Congressman. We try to talk about policy when you join us here, its connection to the markets, the way Washington impacts Wall Street. But there's been a big distraction recently called Jeffrey Epstein, and we keep bumping into it just like you are. Bring us outside of the Beltway. Are people bringing this up to you at home?
I mean, a little bit. I do hear from certain constituents that, they just, I think what is the issue here, Joe, is that people want to know that they can trust their government. And I agree with that. And so transparency is really important here. Of course, the JFK files were released, and also Martin Luther King Jr. files were released. And Epstein is one of those. Of course, it's obviously more recent. And I think that's what people just want to know, that the government's being honest. And so while it may have taken a little more time than what we expected, I think there's certain reasons that the Trump administration is being very careful with it. And I think that as I trust them to release the information as it's appropriate. But, most people are saying, hey, just let us have it. We can decide what's, the right conclusion, for each individual. But I know that they are also more interested in, really the security and safety of the country and also the economy, which is always the most important factor at the end of the day.
Well, so on the economy, I want to return to your point on interest rates, Congressman, as I noticed you posted on X a few days ago that you agree with the criticism from the FHFA director, Bill Pulte, that he has aimed toward the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell. You say it's spot on and that, quote, Powell's poor decisions are standing in the way of a booming Trump economy and American prosperity. But does that kind of pressure from Pulte, from you, from others in the administration actually risk undermining the legitimacy and the independent credibility of the Federal Reserve, which could have detrimental economic impacts all on its own?
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I've had breakfast with other committee members on financial services with Jerome Powell. He's a very nice man. We always have a lot of good conversations. They obviously have their metrics and their statistics and research that they've done on what's going on within the economy and how they come to their objectives of course, keeping inflation low and keeping unemployment rates low as well. But I think it's just important for us as members of Congress to talk about what we hear in the district. When you talk to homeowners and you talk to realtors and you talk to small businesses, that's a big concern right now, is just the fact that home real estate sales are just very flat. There's not much movement. Home prices are high, but it's just simply because there aren't that many buyers. And especially if you're in one of the 3% or even lower, in some cases, interest rates with your home mortgage, it's pretty tough to go out and buy a home that's a higher price and a higher interest rate, considering the circumstances. Some people are doing it because they have to, but I think you would see a lot more velocity and a lot more activity if those interest rates were a tad lower. And I think most of us feel that if there wouldn't have been an interest rate reduction right before the election this last time, it wouldn't have felt political. But it almost feels a little bit political right now.
Well, that's, what the concern is, that if there's an interest rate cut now or in September, the market's going to ask, hey, was this a gift to Donald Trump? Was the Fed chair under pressure? But I want to ask you, Congressman, about what happens when you come home. You're going to be spending time, of course, with friends, family, and constituents, and you're not going to have a lot of time to take care of budget matters when you return. There are a lot of Democrats who are very sore about the rescissions package that passed and the promise of another one. And many of them have told us that they're not game to deal with Republicans about writing a new budget because they can't trust you. Does that ensure a government shutdown?
Well, it sure seems like the Democrats do want to see a shutdown. There was a lot of talk about Chuck Schumer not agreeing to the 60-vote cloture vote on the last CR. And he got a lot of pressure from the left wing of the Democrat Party. And I think that they're probably boxed in a bit and that they're not interested in working together with Republicans. There's a lot of bills right now, whether it's the MAHA bills, whether it's cryptocurrency, some international bills that we had in financial services dealing with Syria and the sanctions that are on Syria. Working together is really, positive for everybody. But, I think that unfortunately, some Democrats just don't want to see Trump have a victory. Look at the polling. I think that, one thing that we know about politicians is that a lot of them look at polling and they should realize that they're underwater more than they're normally used to. And I think that there's a lot of people here in America that are starting to realize how much debt that the American taxpayer is holding through the federal government. $37 trillion is just not sustainable. $1 trillion in debt service is irresponsible. And so a CR, I think, some people have to, we don't always like them, but in this case, if we could get a year-long CR, that might be the best we can get. A shutdown tends to usually not help the party that it's blamed for.
Well, as you talk about the best that Congress might be able to get, we heard the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen talking today about the best deal that Europe could get, as they have at least a handshake agreement with the U.S. now for a 15% tariff rate on European exports, just one of a number of deals that we're tracking, including, of course, not necessarily comprehensive trade deals, but agreements with other countries like Australia, which is going to be purchasing more American beef, which I know is an issue that you care about deeply. Is all of this evidence that the threat of tariffs is actually working, and is the potential economic cost of that okay as a result?
Well, not only do we have the greatest military in the world, we also have the greatest economy in the world. And President Trump knows that. And that's why he's utilizing our economy for pressure on countries like Russia, also the European Union. I know France is a little miffed about it and feeling like they got pressured into this trade deal. But the fact is that, the United States and our economy, we're big consumers, but we're also large producers. And President Trump is finally looking out for our productivity in this country. In my district in particular here in Northeast Indiana, I can take you to schools where, their student enrollment used to be 6,000 students back in the 80s, and now it's 3,000 students. And that's just simply because manufacturing jobs left, went either to Mexico or went overseas, where it was easier to do business. And now President Trump is really leveling the playing field. And I think that we're starting to see, I know we're starting to see here in Northeast Indiana, more orders coming in manufacturing. And so those are all positives. The European Union just needs to realize a good business partnership and a relationship is going to be good for them in the long run. And we can all be winners here. But the United States has had this steady decline over time. And President Trump's, agreeing with the American people that enough's enough and we've got to level the playing field. And that's what's happening.
Marlin Stutzman, not only a Republican congressman, but co-owner of Stutzman Farms. Are you a ribeye guy or do you go with the strip?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I sure like a good ribeye, and we've started raising some Wagyu beef, and that's a tough one to beat.
Let's talk about that next time. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us, as always, on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, Thailand and Cambodia have reached an immediate and unconditional ceasefire after fighting broke out along their disputed border. We'll bring you the details. And as President Trump wraps up his trip abroad, we'll discuss the political implications of these trade deals when we assemble our political panel. They're up ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. As we move now to the stories that we're watching in today's Power Brief. Thailand and Cambodia have agreed to halt 5 days of fighting along their disputed border that has killed at least 36 people after President Donald Trump's tariff threats accelerated a regional push for a diplomatic solution. The ceasefire agreement was reached earlier today at a meeting between the country's leaders hosted in Malaysia. In separate calls with the leaders of Thailand and Cambodia over the weekend, President Trump threatened Washington would not reach trade deals with either as long as the fighting continued. The ceasefire will take effect tonight at midnight.
Commuters from Connecticut could soon be paying more to get into New York City. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority is considering a plan that would increase fares on the Metro North Railroad by 10% over the next 2 years. The MTA board will vote on the proposal Wednesday, and any increase will have to be approved by both states. Meanwhile, New York City's congestion toll brought in nearly $335 million in the program's first 6 months, despite a legal challenge. The roughly $9 toll also cut Manhattan traffic by 25%. But the fate of the toll remains uncertain as a U.S. district judge considers the Trump administration's effort to end the program.
And Donald Trump wants Rupert Murdoch to sit for a deposition within the next 15 days in the president's $10 billion libel suit against the Wall Street Journal over a story about Jeffrey Epstein. In a court order filed today, Trump's lawyers argue an expedited schedule is justified because Murdoch is 94. He is chairman emeritus, of course, of News Corp, parent of journal publisher Dow Jones. Trump is accusing the group of maligning his character in a journal story recently reporting he had once sent a suggestive birthday letter to Epstein. News Corp did not respond to a message seeking comment.
And joining us now with their reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg politics contributors Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Both of them in our D.C. studios with us today, which is always a special treat. Of course, while we're all here in Washington, President Trump is not. He's still in Scotland. Rick, has he successfully, by leaving the country, helped to divert attention away from the Epstein story and toward other things like trade?
Well, you would have thought that would be a natural conclusion, except that he brings it up today in Scotland. So lack of self-discipline, I guess. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think there's plenty more to talk about. Your quick minute of news is, emblematic of the fact that there's a lot going on that Donald Trump has his hand in. And that is helping to quell some of that. But I would say, Donald Trump talked about it today. J.D. Vance talked about it in Ohio today. Yeah. Members of Congress are talking about it. I mean, it's the thing that just won't go away. Maybe Labor Day is the best shot they have of turning the page.
Got a longer answer than I expected from Marlin Stutzman about it just now. Donald Trump, at every turn recently, has been asked about Ghislaine Maxwell. Always includes the fact that he's allowed to pardon her. When asked if he's considering it or if he will, he starts, well, I'm allowed to, but. What does that tell you?
First of all, it tells us that Donald Trump never wants to say he can't do something.
Okay.
So even this, but you would think he would say on this that he would not, do that in the context of somebody accused and found guilty of what she's been found guilty of. Yeah. But he's keeping it open. And, to Rick's point that he keeps talking about it, it's also similarly bizarre that the Deputy Attorney General spends 2 days interviewing her with nobody else apparently present. Right. And that's a very odd thing for a Deputy Attorney General to do. They usually don't interview. But if the Trump administration wants to shut down talk about Epstein, they are not doing a very good job. It is very much the story, the number one story, and it was the number one story on the Sunday shows and into Today in Scotland.
Well, and of course, today, Ghislaine Maxwell asked the Supreme Court to overturn her conviction. Her lawyers essentially are saying the administration is attempting to distract the justices from her effort to convince them, or in an effort to convince them not to take up her appeal. It's a story we'll continue to follow. But if President Trump hadn't talked about it today, we probably would have spent all day talking instead about the trade deal that he was able to strike while in Scotland with the European Union. 15%, not the 30% that he threatened Rick would take effect come Friday, the deadline of August 1st. But when Europe puts its hands up, and Ursula von der Leyen says, look, this is the best I could do, much to the chagrin of other Europeans, is that evidence that Donald Trump is the ultimate victor here? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, this was a landmark agreement. And the idea that we were going to get that over a weekend, basically, which was billed as just sort of almost like a courtesy call, and it turns out to be the announcement of a trade deal with the EU, is extraordinary. And as you point out, not all the leaders of the many nation states that make up the EU are particularly happy about it. But at the end of the day, check mark for Donald Trump. He's got now a deal with Japan, a deal with the Great Britain, a deal with the Europeans. I mean, the reality is he is on pace to settle the score on trade with most of our major trading partners around the world in a very short period of time. And so we'll see. Is the American public ready to absorb that extra 15% tariff on all that wine that Joe buys every time?
Here I am on an island. Boy, I don't know, Jeannie. The casual observer here might think that this tariff idea is working pretty well.
Yeah, but since I'm in D.C., can I spar with Rick a little bit? Is this now how we define deals? This thing is an outline. Nobody has signed off on it. Japan comes back and says, oh, this investment, it's going to be a loan. Yeah. We don't know what this magical investment from Europe looks like. You've got France, you've got Germany coming back. There are no details to this. I wonder, is the Trump administration at some point going to regret a premature celebration they seem to be having, saying these are deals when nothing has been signed off on yet? And then, of course, don't even get me started on the long-term impact, or to Rick's point, the fact that we will be paying 15%. It is not a tax on foreign countries. It is not a tax on Europe. It is a tax on us if we want those goods. I could go on and on, but I will stop now.
They left the wine for another day.
I left the wine, that's
holding
right.
out on that, yeah.
Well, and of course, they're still working on China. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Stockholm as we speak with his Chinese counterpart completed one day of talks today. There'll be another one tomorrow after we saw talks in London that followed up on talks in Geneva. All of them seem to just reinforce what we thought was originally agreed to. Rick, how badly does the administration also want to say, hey, look, we're making progress on China, too?
Yeah, well, remember, what caused Geneva was an all-out trade war that shut down trade between U.S. and China.
Tariffs more than 100%.
Those tariffs are actually still in place. We just have now agreed not to apply them. And so as long as they keep meeting in nice places in Europe and not applying tariffs, it's a good strategy, I think. And everyone gets a nice weekend in Geneva or in London or in Stockholm. So, look, we don't have a trade deal. We have a truce. And having a truce where we get what we need, rare earths, and they get chips, seems like a pretty practical truce. I would not have expected that of the Trump administration to deal with China in a practical way. What may come out of this one, though, is been previewed by the president today, and that was maybe a trip to China, maybe a summit meeting with Xi on the sidelines of one of the big meetings coming up. So there could be really significant progress, not just on trade, but this geopolitical relationship that we have with China that right now is, if not near broken.
Looks like the deadline's moving either way. That's the goal. As Kayleigh mentioned, Scott Bessent said last week, quote, we'll be working out what is likely an extension, Jeannie. Is that the definition of taco or a smarter path to reaching a deal?
I think it's the only path. China is not going to sign off on a deal unless Xi and Trump, it's been agreed to prior, and then they meet, and that'll likely be in October or November. But there is so much to be done before they get to a deal, including China's demand now that the United States unfreeze its tech, which is very dangerous for the United States from a security perspective. And then, as Donald Trump talks in Scotland today about secondary sanctions, we also had Scott Bessent talk about the fact that they wanted to put that on the table for this meeting in Stockholm. And of course, you have the Chinese coming back and saying that cannot be a demand from the U.S. So that it really raises a question about what happens with these secondary sanctions, because that's now an issue in Stockholm.
Of course, the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, Wendy Sherman, was on with us earlier this hour, Joe, and she views that secondary sanctions threat as largely a bluff and thinks Vladimir Putin might feel the same way.
Well, we're going to be watching a couple of different deadlines rolling here. What a treat to have our panel in studio, both together in the flesh. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, we thank you. As always, we're going to have much more to talk about on this front tomorrow. And in the meantime, we invite you to check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online with the prospect, Kayleigh, for more deals. August 1st is Friday, and there could be more where these came from still.
Yep, and August 12th, of course, is shortly thereafter. So we'll see if we do get another 90-day or some other period of trade truce agreed to between the U.S. and China in Sweden, as that second day of talks will be taking place tomorrow, as President Trump is also set tomorrow to wrap up his trip to Scotland and head back here to Washington. And we'll have it all covered for you on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. So we'll see you then right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.